Hello, everybody. Perfect. I think we're going to start if you're ready. So hello, everybody. My name is Clara Frey. I'm an assistant at the Architekturmuseum der TU München. And we right now have the exhibition called The Architecture Machine. And in the exhibition, you also see a video game programmed by You+Pea, who I'm talking today, which is really nice for having you today. And the exhibition will be shown till January 10th, 2021. And yes, I'm introducing you. You are living or based in London, and you also lead a studio called Videogame Urbanism at the Bartlett School of Architecture. And yes, you programmed a game called the London Developers Toolkit, which we will see later. And yes, welcome and hi.
Thank you. Hello, and hello everyone. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, hi, thanks.
And also for everybody later, please ask your questions at the end of the talk. That would be great. Yeah, so you both teach at the Bartlett School of Architecture. How come that you have a studio called Videogame Urbanism there? I mean, that's something new to a lot of universities.
Yeah, I think although we studied architecture, we had the opportunity to teach on the urban design course. So we thought this would be a really good opportunity to be a bit more experimental with our kind of methods, our teaching methodologies. And I don't know, having both played games, we kind of thought, well, what if the primary output for the studio would actually be video games? So it was kind of an experiment when we started it, because also there wasn't much precedence for doing that as a kind of as the driving output. And while we had some knowledge as to how to make games, and obviously we enjoyed playing them, we really wanted to insert a kind of new culture into the school, especially to kind of counterpoint some of the other more computationally driven methodologies that were going on in the course. So yeah, we wanted to create this culture where us and the students could build it and develop it together.
Yeah, that's great. How does, I mean, the Bartlett School of Architecture was always very famous for maybe some experimental things. So how does it fit in the history of the school, your studio maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think since probably 30 years now, since Peter Cook was the head of the architecture school, we've had a kind of a real history of very kind of experimental work. And so in a sense, there was two parts to that which led us towards video games. The first of which is that as Peter did with Archigram, or Rainer Banham also did, who's obviously another influential figure from the Bartlett, there was a kind of, I think, an interest in technology, but technology in relation to popular culture. So obviously the work of Archigram was about imagining architectural possibilities, but it was quite closely related to advances in technology, advances in pop culture. You know, they made issues of their magazine looking at sci-fi architecture in comic books and things like that. And likewise, I suppose, with reference to Banham, who we've also written about in our own work, there was kind of ideas like when he wrote about the idea of the great gizmo of architecture sort of regulated by mass-produced objects. And so for us, you could kind of easily apply Banham's sort of idea of the gizmo onto a computer or onto a games console. And so this idea of how technology might allow us to have new experiences, new dreams, to produce kind of experimental spaces that maybe test some of the things that physical architecture may or may not be able to do. I think for us that was quite appealing, and our school, luckily for us, our school is quite receptive to, doing these kind of what might seem improbable or crazy things, and really running with that as an idea.
Great. And also, I mean, you were be able to do this idea at your university, and you also want to reach a wider audience with this. Does that really happen? Like, do you get a good response by it? And how do people respond to your studio?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've had a good response. I think one thing that we want to push more, and it kind of happened a bit last year in the current circumstances, was to look into how these pieces of work can be communicated as games. So there's obviously a difference between single player and multiplayer games. So last year, because of the COVID shutdown, we started to ask our students to look at how they could network their games. So they could play games with other people in the school, they could play games that they'd made with their friends. And I think that added a kind of another layer of communication onto the way that the work is kind of disseminated. But I think generally people that a lot of people, especially people who are into games, become really excited by this idea because they never thought that an architect would be so interested in it. And even having shown some of our student work in the past to games design students, it's kind of interesting because they would come, our students will come at it from a completely different angle that they might not have thought of. And I don't think we would be sort of arrogant enough to say that our students are going to be better game designers in the end because they're studying something different. But it's really interesting, I think, even from people from the games industry to like have those other ideas come in.
Yeah, I think it's a different skill set really, and a different perspective. You know, the way that we're kind of taught and trained to design space as an architect is completely different from how you'd construct space in a game. So I think it's, yeah, a really interesting kind of balance between those two perspectives. And then similarly, you know, in the kind of cultural institution world, which obviously is great that we have a game displayed in a museum. I think that's the conversations are always about different ways of engaging people with the work and members of the public, which is also something that we're really interested in exploring and challenging too.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially in the time that we are in right now, and that something like this gets more important every day. And also, I looked at your at your website, and you can see a lot of great games that you made in the Videogame Urbanism. And do you think, especially now, that computer games or the digital can do stuff or create a dialogue better that the real world can't, or that you couldn't do when you would be in university and talking to them? Or do you think that the digital can do something better?
I think it's different. I think that, funnily enough, you know, before the kind of crisis happened, we would spend a lot of time talking to our students in person and sitting with them and looking at their screens and understanding, I suppose, the structure of what they're creating. But I think at the same time, I think there's certainly kind of levels of communication that games can allow for people to have. I think one of the things that's always really interested us about games in particular, and maybe some of the games that our students have done and our own ones, is this idea of opening, I suppose, opening architecture to non-experts. You know, I think if you think of something like Minecraft, which is the most influential example of that, you have millions of people engaging in some form of, you could call, architectural design on a platform that wasn't completely, you know, designed for that. But you can see there's such a sort of motivation, such a desire for people to create spaces and to author them, that I think for us, that's one of the key things of the work that we've been doing, is to understand how we can also make structures as architects and urbanists that are designed expressly for people to participate in who aren't from the same background as us as well.
Yeah, I think the dialogue can be much more immediate, much more visual, and much more kind of responsive to the conversation, which is, yeah, something that really excites us.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain degree as well, it can be something that can break down hierarchy quite a lot, because if we're playing a game online, you don't know if you're playing with someone in their 30s, someone in their 50s, someone who's 13 years old, and actually it can end up being, the equalizer can be your performance within the structure of that game, rather than whether you're richer or poorer. And that's not to say that they completely wipe those things out, of course not, but I think it's really interesting that some of these platforms do provide, through the equalizing property of the game structure. Of course, there's new power structures in the game, but they're not necessarily the same ones as in reality, which I think allows us to, you know, readjust who the protagonists are in some of these things.
Yeah.
to actually come to your game, which is shown at the exhibition. This is it. You sadly haven't seen it in real, I guess.
No.
So this is how it looks at the exhibition. I went there also today, and I played the video game before, and it's very nice. So you can go there for the people or for the visitors, they can play it, and they can even later print out their builded building. And you can see somebody touching here the video screen. And this is your poster also behind with all the buildings that someone can build. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more. I show you here for everybody who haven't gamed it yet or played it yet. This is the starting with a very nice song. And yes, can you tell us maybe more about it? What was your intention behind it, and what was your maybe message with that game called the London Developers Toolkit?
Yeah, so I think we've been in London for, I guess, nearly 2 decades, and in that time, the city's undergone quite a lot of changes. And I think one of the key things that you notice is how many big luxury new apartment blocks are coming up that aren't affordable for us as professionals, and so certainly aren't affordable for people who aren't lucky enough to be in our position as well. And I think that was the kind of essential theme of the game, was to look into maybe the way that the character of the city is being changed through some of these developments. So not only do those developments obviously affect the skyline, but they affect maybe the spirit of the city as well, because there's all these big advertising hoardings and things around the city, all of which is more boastful about how great that development is compared to another one. So really this game is looking at the sort of typology of high-rise luxury residential living, but also maybe the way that architecture and designers are kind of complicit in creating certain types of imagery. In this case, the game is ultimately about the player making a sort of satirical advertisement for one of these towers. So it kind of came as a response to our feeling about the city, and the fact that even some councils in London have done their own sort of counter adverts to the gentrification of some parts of their city, which they see as that they can't fight against. But in a way, the game kind of, it gives the player a bit of agency, but it's quite hard to actually fail the game in the end. You're sort of always taken through to the end, so there's a certain sort of sad inevitability to things. But really, I think it sort of becomes this critique also through maybe the way that we take the different components of the buildings as well. So some of these, they're all sort of made through the voxel Minecraft style. So it's this kind of cute equalizing style. But some of the components are real buildings from London. Some of the components are real ideas that maybe we read about and researched in articles and things like that. And some of them are obviously fictional as well. And we're kind of interested by that tension between what's real and what's fictional, because it's also true that many of the images and representations that we see of these buildings and these pieces of architecture are often quite fictional before the building gets built. And there's quite a lot of examples in London. You could go to somewhere like City Road, where the buildings that were originally shown might look kind of quite interesting, but the building that's actually been built has been cost engineered and built in such a way that it looks really bad compared to the original drawing.
Hoardings which are kind of selling this fantasy or this illusion of a particular lifestyle or character that they want to have in those developments, which is kind of ridiculous, because they usually have no relationship with the community that they're being embedded in. And also the other kind of interface related mechanism that we wanted to get through the game is that you're kind of playing from the position of a very subservient, or I guess complicit architect, with these two kind of very rich white developers, and you're kind of going through trying to convince them of your lovely napkin sketches, and then prove to them that you can meet all of their efficiency targets, and then this will generate the kind of perfect product for them. So that was kind of fun to deal with.
Yeah, it's also very fun to play. I can really recommend it to everybody, and it's a very nice way to bring that kind of message to the visitor. And it really is something great in that exhibition. Also, all of your games seem to be very colorful and very bright. Is that also a critique at the architecture, or do you see architecture also in real life as bright as in your games, or it should be?
I think I guess it's another way of kind of engaging people. You know, people are always sort of attracted to things which look bright and colourful, and you know, rather than super realistic. I think you can simulate a lot of conditions which are very much sort of super saturated beyond the real world. You can also, I guess, through that tell stories or narratives of more serious things through this kind of colourful, playful facade, which is definitely something this game does, but that's for sure.
Yeah, I think you know, some of our colleagues that don't make games or don't necessarily engage with game culture in the same way often ask us, you know, why don't these things look more realistic? But for us, I think it also taps into this idea that virtual places, that the kind of worlds that people experience in games are, I mean, for us, they're not real, but they're increasingly being kind of understood as being real places that have kind of complex social structures and are a sense of, you know, offer a sense of place to people. And I think, as we sort of mentioned, the lockdown kind of brought that into sharp focus, I think, with a lot of people who weren't game players. But for us, it's interesting because there's a whole palette of materials and colors that would kind of be unachievable in reality that we can also integrate into our game space architecture. And so I suppose in a way we're naturally drawn to those type of things rather than wanting to completely replicate reality, which I suppose is interesting because a lot of the biggest game development companies spend a lot on, you know, millions of pounds developing graphic techniques in order to make things look more like reality. And I suppose they themselves have also, their engines have started to be adopted by architectural visualization companies and things like that in order to do, you know, a really high quality real-time rendering of architecture, how it actually looks.
But I guess on the other hand, you have companies like Nintendo who keep everything quite simple and much more, the level of detail is much lower resolution, but you're still super engaged with them for other reasons, either through attachment to characters or you're being pulled into the narrative in a different way. So that's also interesting to us to not see those two things as, you know, it has to be one or the other, I guess.
Yes, true. And also to come a bit to the book, which you see behind me, of the exhibition, there's also text about this gameplay in it, and it's placed in the chapter 4 called "The Computer as an Interactive Platform." So would you, what you said right now, would you think that it really fits into that chapter, or can you relate to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're increasingly seeing the games that we make as potentially platforms. I think games themselves have gone from, you know, in 20 years ago, games might have tended towards being mostly single player. I mean, there was still multiplayer game. Maybe if you go back even longer, if you go back, you know, 25 years ago, then games were in some ways a bit more like films in that there was a sort of singular narrative. Whereas now, if we look at the most successful games, they're pretty much all social spaces. They're all networked environments in some ways. So I think we can definitely consider games to be platforms. So I think we sort of use the computer as a platform in order to then design game software, which in turn becomes a platform in itself. So I think with this particular project as well, from the start, we wanted it to have this integration with, you know, the social media feed and with also the printer. So you can print your own drawings, which is not something that most games typically allow you to do. But again, for us, it's important because it sort of then blurs the line between it being a satirical game and a design tool. So people are actually designing things using this game. They might be a bit silly, and we wouldn't necessarily suggest that like we endorse the things that come out of it as good design pieces, but nonetheless, the game is providing a platform for some form of kind of user expression through this.
Yeah, I guess we're always trying to define or broaden or test the limits of what you can classify as a game, I suppose? Does it need to include winning or losing, or, can something be defined more as a tool, a design tool, as Luke's saying, or a kind of visual toy, or what is it that makes it a game? But how far can you push that as well through other connection to other platforms and other types of media?
Yeah, and also, I mean, you use it as a teaching method, and I study at the TU Munich in my master in architecture, and I can say that we don't have anything like your studio at our university, and I think a lot of other universities don't have it either. So would you think that maybe this is missing out, or this method of teaching is missing in a lot of other universities to study architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so, but it really depends on, again, we're kind of lucky enough to have a culture at the Bartlett that allows us to do this. That's not to say that the cultures of other universities aren't, as equally valid, that might have a different opinion about this type of work, I suppose. I think for us, one of the things that we always try to stress to the students is that maybe when they come, they think games are kind of silly. Games are what I waste my time, and games are the reason why I nearly didn't get onto the course, because I didn't get my grades or something like that. But we then say, well, actually, if you think about a game and what you're doing in it, it's all about somebody's relationship with a space through a set of, we could say a set of rules, but they're also like a set of ways of being within the world. And so when they're designing a game, they have to think very carefully about who their client is, how that person is going to use the thing that they've set up. So straight away, some of the the big questions about designing architecture and designing buildings, and in terms of their function, and we could say that how they're programmed as spaces. Video game spaces tend to be incredibly tightly programmed, because they might be programmed not as a house, but as a space that someone needs to climb across. Therefore, the whole architecture of that space will be about facilitating the characters climbing in a certain way, for instance. So I think once we let them kind of think about those things a bit more, they kind of understand that there are actually, and I think this is something we've written about quite a lot, there are quite a lot of aesthetic similarities between the way that game spaces operate and the way that architecture operates, even though many game spaces, if not most of them, haven't been designed by architects, and vice versa. There's not so many architects designing video games. But I think they do share a lot of similarities, and maybe a lot of concerns that are appropriate for both sides of the digital divide.
Yeah, I think maybe what it does do in the context of the school and the evolution of architectural education is kind of says that it's okay, and positively looks at engaging more popular forms of digital technology. Video games might have traditionally be seen for something for kids, but all the people who were playing games and grew up playing games have also grown up, so the audience is much wider. It's just something that is much more embedded in our kind of lives now. So I think that side of it, and also breaking down the kind of conceptions of it being, highbrow or lowbrow media, I think by kind of putting it in this educational context, I think we're hoping to show how digital culture's moved on a bit more.
And also, I mean, you just said it, they come together, gameplay and architecture. Would you call yourself an architect or architects, or would you call yourself now game designers, or how would you call yourself?
I'm not sure. I guess like technically I'm an architect.
And I'm not in the UK system, so.
But that's not to say that we can't begin to redefine what that is. I suppose if things are always going to be outputted or in a game world, we maybe don't need to formally become architects in the same way. I don't know. It's not something we're, I suppose, always defining, but
yeah, I mean, I suppose, although we haven't completely, I think, formed exactly what it is, I think our work is interested by the idea of a hybrid practice in the future. So might an architect, realize some works physically, because we've also done that, in other projects as well. And might they also realize work digitally, and what's the sort of differences between those, but what's also the sort of similarities in the approach that might be applied across those? So I think in the past, like a project we did for the RIBA last year, where we took elements of picturesque architecture and kind of made physical fragments that were then connected to video game worlds. For us, that kind of hints at some sort of hybridized practice. But also, I mean, maybe this relates a bit to your previous question. It importantly for us, I think, connects things to history and connects things to other projects that came before. So looking at picturesque architecture, we can see how many similarities there are to the way that they might treat landscapes, to the way that video game designers might treat landscapes. Or likewise, if we think of like Archizoom's work and No Stop City, and these ideas of these kind of free spaces that people could be playfully assemble, form, because all of the services and everything are being catered for. Or even like Piranesi's etchings, where he makes these paradoxical spaces that can't really exist in reality. For us, there's all these moments in architectural history as well that I think resonate quite well with both the video game, but also, I suppose, a form of architectural practice that like pushed at the boundaries of what the discipline could be.
Yeah, that's true. We also, I mean, at the exhibition, we show that since the 60s, the computer came more and more into architecture, and there were always some people who refused to work with computers or to draw with computers. I mean, nowadays everybody in an architecture office has to work with a computer, but are there still like colleagues of yours or people around that that still refuse to go with the computer and maybe with game design?
I suppose it's different contexts, really. For example, in architecture practice where I was working, we would kind of halt using the computer until we got to a certain point with our design, and then when we were comfortable that we had that and that we had things that were made by hand, now it's time to kind of make that step and draw things up. So, but that's not to say that you wouldn't go back to not using the computer at certain times as well. I think every practitioner is different. I suppose in education it's a bit more on an individual basis, depending on how students are approaching something. In terms of people refusing to use a computer, I'm not sure there are anymore. Maybe a few years ago, but everyone seems to kind of be embracing the fact that digital culture is and should be part of our methods now in one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have some eminent professors at the Bartlett who write a lot about digital culture, and then we have some eminent professors who don't necessarily know so much about this, but having had one as one of my PhD supervisors as well, it's really great to have those conversations where you can start to make those connections between things that we might consider old ways of doing things and these kind of new ways. And I think even if you look at the history of drawing, and we actually made a little game again for the RIBA a few years before that was looking at Hans Frederman de Vries's perspectival studies, you can see that some of the traditions or structures of like hand drawing that you might grow up, you might study when you're in your first year of architectural education, for instance. They're also kind of synthetic constructions that then influenced the way that we design virtual cameras, that then influenced the way that we design, the software that we then draw on, which might have started as a sort of facsimile of pen and paper. So I think that, of course, there are some people who might, subjectively enjoy media that's analog more than digital or computational ones, but I think we can also then make a lot of connections between the digital tools that we use when we're working on computers and those analog principles that came before them. So I think generally we haven't encountered that many people who've been just completely
Resistant.
unreceptive to it. And in fact, they're more enthusiastic by the idea that if they, for instance, if they're a real expert, like we have people who are experts on picturesque architecture, suddenly we can come around 200 years later and say, actually, there's a whole industry that uses kind of similar treatments of the environment, that's doing it in a complete, they might not even, the people designing these game worlds might not even necessarily know about that movement, but actually there's a lot of similarities between some of their kind of aesthetic approaches. So I think we try to see it like a positive about making more connections rather than making the lines between the camps generally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a great opportunity that you have with the games, that you can reach a wider audience with it and maybe get more positive response as well, and more to come. And so I also have the question that we have also at the end of the exhibition. We think of what is for the future to come, and what do you see for the futures of of computers to come in architecture, and yeah, what do you see? What will happen?
Big question.
Yeah. I think from our specific side, we could maybe answer that in relation to the brief that we're looking at this year with our students, which is to look back at Buckminster Fuller's World game, which was, you know, a giant game that he proposed for solving all of the world's problems, which was one of his sort of life's works. And for us, that was really interesting, this idea that Fuller was waiting for, and he said that he was waiting for computational technology to catch up with this like massive database of resources that he'd worked out for the whole world. And in a sense, we do actually have that technology now to be able to approximate something. But at the same time, we don't necessarily have the world that has no borders, you know, that's completely fluid, that he imagined, that where every world leader would come together really friendly and play this kind of big computerized game together. And I think what we're also interested by in relation to that is the idea of things like the metaverse. So the idea of a giant secondary online world. But I think as the game designers who will be at the forefront of that realize, it's very unlikely to be achieved by one piece of technology. So it's very unlikely that one game engine will become the de facto, you know, second world that we're in, because there are so many competing ones and they all have different properties and different abilities. And so what might become more interesting is this idea of platforms and connections between those platforms, and whether we might be able to build, you know, huge online infrastructure through being able to connect smaller pieces together. And I think for us, that's the kind of counterpoint to Fuller's idea of one game, is that we might actually, the future might be many different networked online games, or we could say sort of second realities, but they're all connected through some sort of protocol which enables them to communicate. Yeah. So that we could be having tutorials with our students and building things in one game world, but suddenly we could connect to something else that might be, you know, connected to information about our you know, our local surroundings, but made by our council or something like that. And I think the idea of that kind of communication and connection could be really powerful in terms of breaking games out of they're still encased worlds at the moment. Generally speaking, they're still proprietary. You know, they're still pieces of software that are owned, that are, generally speaking, you know, used to generate money, and even the platforms are obviously still built on that model. But I think for us, the exciting idea might be how those platforms can also cross. And I think that connects into what we are really excited about, this idea of an architectural discipline that kind of goes between virtual, real, but maybe 10 different virtual realities as well.
This is, yeah, it's an open question and it's a tricky question. So thank you for trying to answer it. And yeah, we are about at the end of the talk, and we maybe get some more questions. But first, you just saw it in for a second. Just for everybody to know that the Architekturmuseum, the exhibition in German called Die Architekturmaschine, will be till the 10th of January next year. And we have also some more talks and other events that you also can see at our website or Instagram or Facebook. So be very happy to see what's coming. And also the next 3 talks will be also on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. And we have one with Heike Werner, we have then with Daniel Cardoso, and also at the end with Christopher Sharples from Shop Architects. So we look forward to that as well. And also for everybody who saw that in the background and maybe not will be not able to come to the exhibition because of COVID and everything that will come. We have a very nice book. It's available in German and in English. And there's also, as we said before, a text about your game in it and a lot of other very nice texts. And yes, if you like, you can buy it. It's very nice. And I would stop this presentation and open questions, and to the audience, if anybody has a question, please ask. I hope you can, if anybody has a question. Hello. Oh, wait, Ms. Werner, we don't hear you.
Okay, now you hear me, I think. Hi. Yeah, my question is, this is a fascinating game, and it's obvious that architecture is so political when you talk about these high-rise for luxury livings, and so it seems to me like a little bit like digital activism, to have this online, to make people aware of this also. And was this a part of your concept, this connection between architecture and all these developments, political or economic? Or so did you have that in your concept also?
Yeah, I think so. I think the really fascinating thing about games and what you can kind of design into them is that you have the ability to determine who the player is, you know, who are you playing as and who are you playing against or with. So within that, we were able to kind of showcase or manifest a certain type of relationship, which exists in the kind of procurement of the built environment. So I think that's always really interesting to think who's playing and who you're playing against and who, you know, who the audience is, who the player is, and do you have to play as a bad person to win, or do you have to play well to win, or do you have, you know, what are those kind of powers that you're pushing against or helping to thrive, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose it's quite layered in that way though, because even in games, as Sandra said, there's often this sense that in order to succeed, yeah, you have to do bad things.
So
And
was there already a black tower or something? Kind of.
yeah, I think yeah, our critique is relatively gentle through this game, and probably and probably there are other, you know, statements that can be much more pertinent. So, but I think in a sense, it's as much for us about an architect being able to play this game and sort of maybe understand some of the processes that we go through as designers and how much we're led by the money that we're going to make in the end, which obviously allows us to live, but at the same time ties us into these certain cycles of production and speculation that are causing London to change, for our opinion, perhaps for the negative.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions for You+Pea?
Clara, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Well, obviously, I know your work a little bit since we put it in the show, but I still wanted to mention the one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and which is also why I included all these games in the show, which is this famous story of the Bauhaus and modern architecture being influenced by the games that people like Walter Gropius, but many others played as kids in the 19th century, these building block games that are very blocky, obviously, and not very 19th century in some ways. And some people have argued that the games that these people played have ultimately led them to modern architecture. And, you know, if you agree with that, I'm wondering how much we should pay attention to the aesthetics and the rules in games that people play currently. And, you know, not thinking about a particular one, but if you wanted to mention one, Minecraft is obviously the one I think that's been incredibly influential. And then, you know, if you think about schools like the Bartlett, but many others who are interested in voxels and these kinds of 3D building blocks as design elements, I'm wondering if we can, you know, if we can expect architecture to look more like games at some point in the future when this new generation of architects that's playing games grows up and brings the aesthetics of the games that they've played into the architecture that they're designing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what games you're playing, because if I was to be so influenced by what I'm playing, the world would just look like a big multicolored rainbow made out of various bits of food. But yeah, no, I think that's a really valid point. And, you know, there was that recent thing with the architect's Lego kit, the fact that everything was white and square, which, you know, to an extent is Lego, and, you know, it will do that. But everyone's saying that you can only make modernist buildings with this set, even though it's supposed to be the architect's set. So, you know, what's going on? How do you I suppose, design in that tolerance to be able to allow for lots of different styles and outputs to be generated?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose with reference to Minecraft, yeah, you can certainly see that the voxel building methods might tie in well with the, you know, the generation that's grown up on Minecraft and will be coming to architecture school. Well, probably already are, but especially the younger kids in the next, you know, 5-10 years or whatever. I think it's interesting because the flip side of Minecraft is not just the voxel system, but also the fact that it kind of, the world is entirely patterned. You know, the pattern is really foregrounded because each block has a texture on it, and that texture, the sort of face of that block is really prevalent. So I think we could, from that game, we might also imagine that the like return of patternation and kind of a certain type of ornamentation in terms of its relationship to walls, I think would be something that we might see emerge as well. And it's kind of interesting because we were doing a talk, or doing a YouTube actually for a big game site, and one of the things that came up with one of the other people was how the technology of game engines changed the way that they needed to design architecture, because in the past they had to put lots of patterns onto the walls in order to make the walls look interesting, because otherwise the geometry would be really simple. And so Minecraft obviously harks back to that idea of every surface is patterned in some ways in order to give it some sense of illusion of depth or illusion of materiality. Whereas when you look at the latest ray tracing techniques in graphics cards, they were saying we can now make really realistic brutalist architecture because the light falls across it in a really like convincing way. So we no longer have to put stuff all over the walls to make it look interesting. It can be a bit more like reality in that way. So I suppose, as Sandra says, it really comes back to each game has its unique sort of technological apparatus that causes it to render the world in a certain way.
Yeah, but then I think there's conversations in practice about, you know, trying to be more sustainable and being a bit more conscious about the stuff that you're designing, and this conversation around form factor. So, you know, not designing things that don't kind of stack neatly because they're super inefficient and no one wants to build them, and you're creating all sorts of problems. Whereas when you see the kind of speculative proposals which are very much driven by the design and application of voxels, is kind of like that's completely gone out the window. So I don't know if it's because that kind of language hasn't yet been applied onto the built environment, like actually working with people who are procuring this stuff yet. And maybe when it does kind of hit the real world, I don't know how it will materialize really. That's kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I was also thinking about stuff that Jill and like Molly are doing at the Bartlett, right? Because it kind of ties in with people thinking about robotics and building and these kinds of things, where standardization is very important, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's already been I can't remember what it's called now, but there's a platform where there was a Minecraft server where you could build structures inside of the building bay of a 3D printer, and then you could press a button and it would send a message to a server and export your file and print directly from Minecraft. So I think there's perhaps then for us, the exciting thing about something like that is that although it could be an automated process, the human beings are still very much involved, and there's the levels of desire for creativity that you see in a game like Minecraft wouldn't be completely lost to automation in that way. Of course, some things would be more efficient automated, but at the same time, I think a game like Minecraft in particular just shows the capacity for humans to imagine things if they're given a free tool, nearly free tool, that allows them to kind of test possibilities. And I think for us, that's also one of the key things of how I suppose we contrast games to other ways of thinking computationally. And for us, the idea that games are like a waste of time or a bit trivial is actually really fascinating, because why then do people spend so much time engaging with them? What aesthetic pleasures do they get from it? And if they're not efficient structures, they're not using the computer for efficient reasons, to speed something up, then I think we need to look at what it is that they do and kind of understand how that motivates people. And for us, that we see that as quite some of the context that we're working in the Bartlett as well. Maybe we kind of like the idea that games are slightly a rogue child of computation that kind of can do what they want, but actually they make us think about things, and they expose some of our kind of desires and our imagination in a way that some other computation doesn't in that way.
Yeah,
maybe.
Even if they're using the same software, the motives and the kind of application of that's really different, and the way that the user is involved.
Yeah, it's like you can get amazing amounts of information about cities today, and some of our colleagues in urban design, are doing work like that. But for us, that information would still need to be intelligible for a human being in order for it to work in a game, which means it needs to be processed and it needs to be turned into information that communicates clearly and perhaps excitingly in relation to the person playing it. So it still needs to be filtered back to a human who's actually going to experience it subjectively.
Yes. Thank you, Teresa. For everybody who doesn't know, this is Teresa, the curator of the architecture machine. Anybody has another question? So just nobody? Okay, so I think we're at the end of the talk, and I want to say thank you so much for having time today and for that wonderful game in the exhibition. I really can recommend it to everybody. And yeah, thank you so much. I hope you stay healthy and that you maybe get the chance to come and see it yourself. We really hope the situation gets better. And yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. And yeah, we really love being a part of the show, although we can't visit, and part of the publication. Yeah, it's really, really amazing point in time to be talking about all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think we really love the fact that the hand sanitizer units like built into the thing. It's a really nice
It's a sign
touch.
of the times, isn't it?
So hopefully we might get to see it in person. But thanks very much for having us this evening as well.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who came.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And thank you, and have a nice night, and talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.